Okay. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for being here with us this afternoon. My name is Blair Elliott. I am the Communications and Events Associate at the McGill Institute for the Study of Canada. I would like to begin by acknowledging that while we meet today on a virtual platform, McGill University is located on land which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst Indigenous peoples, including the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabeg nations. We do this to acknowledge the importance of the land upon which we work, study, and live, and to acknowledge the complex web of relationships of which we are a part. The McGill Institute for the Study of Canada, for those who are unfamiliar with our work, is the Centre for Canadian, Quebec, and Indigenous Studies programs at McGill University. MISC supports a multidisciplinary approach to the study of Canada by bringing together students, researchers, and practitioners to discuss important issues about the country's past, present, and future. In addition to our academic programs, MISC also hosts public events, like this lecture today, on a wide range of topics that are important to Canadians. This event is being recorded, and you can watch this and all of our other past events on our YouTube channel at MISC McGill. We welcome you to submit your questions during the lecture using the Q&A feature found at the bottom of your screen. Our director at MISC, Danielle Bélan, will be joining us later to moderate the Q&A discussion. To start off today, I would like to introduce Frédéric Bastien, who is Associate Professor of Political Science at Université de Montréal and the Director of the Center for the Study of Democratic Citizenship, our partners for this event today. Frédéric, over to you.
Merci beaucoup, Blair. C'est un plaisir pour moi de vous souhaiter la bienvenue à cette activité que nous organisons avec l'Institut d'études canadiennes de McGill. And more important, it's a pleasure for me to introduce you to our guest today, Loleen Berdahl, Professor of Political Science at the University of Saskatchewan. Loleen has a very interesting path. She has a PhD from the University of Calgary. And then she worked for about 10 years, I believe, in a policy-related work environment. She spent about 10 years at the Canada West Foundation. And this is an interesting path because, of course, in the academics, especially with PhD students, we focus a lot on the professorship, and we try very hard to get our PhD students well prepared for an academic career. However, there are other interesting careers outside the academic for people who hold a PhD. And 3 years ago, she published a wonderful book with Jonathan Malloy at University of Toronto Press, Work Your Career. And I cannot encourage graduate students enough to read this book, which really widen your perspective of what you can do with a PhD, not only in political science, but generally speaking, in social science. Loleen Berdahl is also a very successful teacher. She has won multiple teaching awards, including the CPSA Award for Teaching Excellence. At the University of Saskatchewan, she has been a leader of the Survey and Group Analysis Laboratory. She is now the Executive Director of the Graduate School of Public Policy. Her research interests are mostly about Canadian politics, political theory, and research methodology. Loleen, who just published with the Oxford University Press a new edition of Conducting Empirical Research in Canadian Political Science. To be more specific, she's interested in Canadian federalism and regionalism, public policy, and public opinions regarding Canadian political issues. She will present today a research about the Western alienation in a transformative era. So, Loleen, thank you very much for being with us today. And I'm looking forward to hear your presentation.
Well, thank you so much, Frederic. And I have to say that that introduction made me feel very warm inside, which is good, because for those of you who have not been following weather in Saskatchewan, it is the opposite of warm. So I like to share this with people just so they can feel better about their own lives. With wind chill here, it's minus 52. Now you might be saying, is that Celsius or Fahrenheit? At that point, it doesn't matter. So it's completely irrelevant. It's just very, very cold here. And I especially want to say thank you. It's a great pleasure to be talking to people in Montreal today, because my last out of Saskatchewan trip pre-COVID was actually to the Université de Montréal, and I had no idea how meaningful that trip would be to me until now. It was a great trip. It was great to speak to the graduate students there, but now it holds a very special memory for me. So I thank you for that. And just while I put my PowerPoint up, and then I'll start talking, I was wondering if the people attending, and thank you all for coming. This is very, very good of you to do on a Friday afternoon. But if you could put in the chat where you're from, and that's one of those questions that has many meanings for people. It's, you know, is where I'm from, where I'm living right now. Is it where I grew up, where I graduated high school? So I'll let you define that for yourself. I know there's some people who are living, they've lived outside Saskatchewan forever, but they consider themselves from Saskatchewan, for example. So if you could let me know where you're from. Oh, I see Merle says that she's from Saskatchewan. So we're winning already. Toronto. Oh well, I'm just joking. So I'm going to put my my slides up here, and or at least I'm going to try, and I'll start talking about Western Canada. And it says that I'm sharing my screen. So now let's see if I can move this so I can, pardon me. Okay, this is, there we go. Play from the start. You'd think I was new to Zoom, but I'm not. All right, so I am going to be talking with you about the resilience of Western alienation in a transformative era. And it's interesting to be talking about Western alienation, and to still be talking about Western alienation. And so, as Frederic mentioned, I had an unusual academic career in that I didn't mean to, and so I finished my PhD at the University of Calgary, and then I decided that the idea of moving around the country for 2 years here, 2 years there, and so on was not very appealing or exciting. And I was able to have a research career in Calgary, where I was living, at the Canada West Foundation, and I found that really suited me. I really enjoyed the immediate engagement with public policy. I enjoyed the opportunity to be engaged with things that were happening so quickly, and so on. And at the time that I was there was a lot of attention. This was during it started during the Chrétien government. There was a lot of attention to issues of Western alienation, and so I very quickly became engaged on issues related to Western Canadian public policy, Western Canadian politics, and the relationship between the Western Canadian provincial governments and the federal government. And oh, now it won't let me advance my slides here. There we go. So it ended up, I initially wrote a book with Roger Gibbons, and we wrote a book about Western Canada in 2003. And it was a book that was rather concerned at the time about Western Canada, and you can tell by sort of the dark cover. We talked about the concerns about Western aspirations in the country not being taken seriously, not being shared, and that these were things that we saw as being a bit problematic. So we had some concerns on that front. things changed a bit. The tone changed a bit, and in 2014 we published a second book, and it's much more optimistic, as you can see by the bright color of our cover. And we were talking a fair bit here about some of the excitement and the feel in Western Canada, and sort of the energy that was being seen. And we ended the book on a bit of a warning note, because God forbid that two political scientists be too optimistic. But we said, that this could be sort of a very temporary state in Canadian politics, and that we might see some change in terms of the tone if we saw changes especially on the economic side. So we were really looking at sort of Western Canada. I've been looking at this for a few decades now, and one thing that really has struck me is how much evolution we see. So 2014, talking about all this optimism in Western Canada, and by 2019, of course, we're seeing this move back to and we have this continued to this day of sort of high levels of Western alienation and sort of regional discontent and so on. And one thing that I've always given thought of when I think about Western Canada is some of the work that Paul Martin did or tried to do as Prime Minister. So Paul Martin was interesting in that he really did pay attention to Western alienation, and that was something that he identified as one of his priorities. So there's a quotation from him from 2003: "No matter what else I do as Prime Minister, if Western alienation is the same as it is at the end of the term it is as now, I will not believe I have succeeded." And he actually partnered with the Canada West Foundation. He did these consultations across Western Canada, and so I was able to meet him and listen in on those discussions. It was really an interesting time. One thing that he said later, and this was in a quotation to a journalist, but that he found it to be a very challenging file. Many files I think are challenging, but he thought this was a particularly challenging one. And he said that Western alienation is something that ebbs and flows, and that it may be a permanent part of the Canadian condition. And I find that to be a very striking idea, that this is just something that might be a permanent thing of who we are as a country. And so it makes me think about the resilience of Western alienation, that things change and that it hangs on. And I've got an image here. Some of you might be old enough in my age range to remember this wonderful Canadian film set to the classic song, The Cat Came Back. And it's this Canadian Film Board film about this cat, and he just keeps coming back, and the guy keeps trying to get rid of this cat, and the cat keeps showing up. And so as a cat lover, I like the opportunity to bring a cat into pretty much everything. But I think it's this question of, why is it so resilient? Is it? And if it is, if national disunity is a permanent feature of Canada, well, what does that mean for us as a country? And what does that mean for us as Canadians? So I'd like to spend most of my time talking today about why I think Western alienation is so resilient, but I will spend some time talking about what I think this means for us as a country. And just for people who are putting questions and answers putting questions, I'm supposed to supply the answers. But for people who are putting questions into the Q&A section, if you're tempted to put in the question of, well, how do we fix this? The answer I can tell you already is unclear. So I will definitely disappoint people if they want the quick solution of just do this policy and it'll be fixed. And the reason that I'd be hesitant to provide a really simple solution is the resilience of Western alienation. Western alienation is long-standing. It's very long-standing in Canada, and it's a response to a particular vision of Canada. And so when I talk about Western alienation, there's always somebody who says, "Oh, well, you know," they always go back to the National Energy Program. So I'm always really struck when I teach Canadian politics, and you know, I'm teaching students that were born in this century, and you can get them riled up about the National Energy Program. And I'm like, do you even know what that is? And it's like, well, no, but I know I'm mad about it. And what's interesting about Western alienation is it predates the National Energy Program. It comes before that. Some people say, well, you know, it's because of Trudeau. It wasn't just the National Energy Program. It was Trudeau, and it was Quebec, and how Quebec was really pushing for things after the Quiet Revolution. But it actually predates the both Trudeaus. It predates the Quiet Revolution. It happened before then. Some people would say, well, it was everything that happened with the Great Depression. And the reality is it predates the Great Depression as well. It goes before then. Some people would say, well, you know, it had to do with the establishment of Alberta and Saskatchewan, and how when they were made into provinces, you know, they weren't given the same rights as other provinces with respect to natural resources. True, but it predates that. It even predates the Riel rebellions. So it goes back a long time. This is a long-standing issue for Canada. And so the long-standing part, I think, I'm hopefully established through these examples. But I believe it's a long-standing response to a particular approach to Canada. And what I believe Western alienation really is, when you get down to it, is it's a response to the centering of central Canada in Canada. And so it's a response to how we function as a country. So we have a tendency and a history of central Canada with the central Canadian vision of Canada being understood as the national vision of Canada, and the central Canadian interests being understood as national interests. And Western alienation, in my mind, is really a response to and a reaction to this centering of central Canada within Canada. Now, you might say, well, that makes sense. And if you look at the history of Canada, it does make sense that central Canada was centered at the start of Canada. So if you look at the population demographics this is just after Confederation, at the time of our first census, you know, over 3/4 of the population lived in central Canada, and beyond that, not only did the bulk of the population live in central Canada, but that's really where the economic activity was. It's where culture was. It's where, you know, it was the driving force of Canada. And so of course it makes sense that that central Canada was the definition of Canada at its start. Absolutely. But at the same time, it's also true that there were other visions and understandings and perspectives on Canada even at that time. Now, what happened is that we had this starting point that was so dominant, that it became a starting point and a standpoint that itself has become very resilient. So this dominant starting point has been very self-perpetuating. It's built into our institutional structures. It's built into our political processes. It's built into our policy choices, and it's built into our narratives. And what this means is that our dominant group perspective is really defined as the default. And then other perspectives are defined in contrast. And so when we think about Western alienation, there's, in my mind, we're seeing sort of a pushing back against this dominant standpoint. And I think this is an important thing to understand, or at least to think about when we think about, well, where's this Western alienation coming from? Why is it being so resilient? Part of its resilience has to do with the resilience of the dominance of this central Canadian centering in Canada. Now, we've seen a lot of change in Canada, of course, and people in Western Canada in particular will say, well, we've really grown. Absolutely. But the reality is as well that we still have a very large dominance of central Canada in Canada. So the centering of central Canada remains very strong to this day, not only in terms of our institutions and in terms of our processes and how we define ourselves as a country, but also in terms of our population. And so when we see this tension emerging that we see with Western alienation, it's sort of that push against this centering. This centering, I will note, is something that I think is a bit unique to Canada. Like if we take the United States as a contrast, and we do love to contrast Canada with the United States always. It would take multiple states, multiple very large states, to have the same dominance that we see of central Canada, or even of Ontario. So this is something that's kind of baked into our federal system. Second reason why I think Western alienation is so resilient is that it goes beyond specific political parties and specific political leaders. So it's very popularly associated with Liberal Party governments and with especially Liberal Party governments with Quebec prime ministers. Now, I won't lie, I had so much fun coming up with the images for this presentation. So for those of you who aren't aware of why I have a picture of Pierre Trudeau giving the finger to people, this is from a museum in BC, because he very famously off the back of a train car in British Columbia gave the flip the bird to protesters. He's not the only unpopular Trudeau, of course, so we've got other pictures there. For those of you who want to look at the very upper corner of the very top photo, there's a sign that I think captures the spirit of some people who are unhappy with Justin Trudeau. The sign reads, "Flush the turd." That's actually less graphic than some of the bumper stickers that I've seen in driving through the prairies. And I know there's some other people from the prairies here, so they can back me up on that point. But there's this tendency to think of Western alienation to be political, exclusively political, tied to particular political parties. But the fact is that we also see Western alienation at times when there's been conservative or progressive conservative governments, or prime ministers from outside central Canada. I think most important to note is that we saw the rise of the Reform Party at the time when we had a progressive conservative government, and at the time when there was very strong representation of the Western provinces in the Mulroney progressive conservative government. So we do see this movement of it across parties and across political leaders. The reason I think this is true is that Western alienation goes beyond politics per se. It's, as I said, it's a response, but it's really a rational response and an emotional response to a sense of unfairness within Canadian federalism. This might be perceived unfairness. This might be actual unfairness, but it's a response to unfairness. There's institutionalized inequalities. Those are two words that are hard to say together, by region, but it's also a sense of national interests benefiting one region and damaging another. And this is something that we see occurring over time. People might immediately think right now in terms of carbon tax and with respect to pipelines and so on. But as these images here show, this goes back for some time. There's also an element to it that we need to keep in mind, and that is this sort of a really strong sense of identity, and identity of an outsider identity, that the West is seen as other. I didn't find it for this presentation, but there was a book, and I think the title of it was something like Ottawa in the Hinterlands, and the idea of us being out in the hinterlands here in Western Canada, and sort of being far away, and not being part of things, I think is very, very important as part of understanding the story of Western alienation. The fact that the Reform Party's original slogan was "The West wants in," I think is very telling, and it's something that really captures a very strong spirit of there were ideological dimensions to that, of course, but the identity side, I think, should not be forgotten, and so I think this all kind of breeds together in a very interesting way. So what we know from the psychological literature is that people aren't just rational beings. That when people make evaluations, when they form attitudes, they're integrating emotion and cognition. They're pulling these parts together, and quite often the rational side is used more to justify and to support emotional responses. So it's not just this sort of sense of well, what's in my rational interest? Do I rationally need a pipeline? Is it it's this stew of emotion and rationality that come together, and then on top of this, we have a very powerful role that's played by political identities, and so these things, I think, come together in a way that really makes Western alienation a particularly resilient force in Canadian politics. All of this together creates a type of lens that Western Canadians, many Western Canadians, see federalism through, and this is a lens of perceived disrespect and perceived exploitation, and sometimes you can point to exact policy cases where it is exploitation, or it is economically disadvantaging the region. Sometimes it might not be, but it's certainly the lens that things are seen through, and it's a lens that is regularly there, and it's also a lens that political actors can very easily invoke and mobilize. So it's often said in prairie politics that if you're not happy with how things are going, you really want to turn attention to the federal government as soon as possible, because there's going to be that ability to really push back against the federal government, no matter what the issue is, and there's a long history for that, and so I think that's something that really comes into play and needs to be understood. Third reason why I think Western alienation is so resilient is because Western, quote unquote, is a very flexible term. Whenever I talk about Western alienation, somebody comes up and they'll be like, they'll think they have like this immediate death to any argument I might be about to put forward. They'll be like, well, there is no Western Canada, and I'll be like, exactly, and that's part of the strength of it too. So Western alienation moves, it shifts. So these are data from the Confederation of Tomorrow survey. So thank you to Andrew Parkin, who I know is here, for allowing me to use these. But the last time the survey was taken, what we see is that Western alienation is currently higher in Alberta and Saskatchewan, a bit lower in Manitoba, and lower still in BC. But what's interesting is it it doesn't just ebb and flow, as Paul Martin said, in Canada. It ebbs and flows within the 4 Western provinces themselves. So I've been studying these data since, I'm trying to think, probably about 2001 was the first time I started working with survey data on Western alienation. And there have been times where BC has been, off the charts in terms of Western alienation. Every now and then, Manitoba gets disgruntled, and they'll pop up. They tend to be more measured on these attitudes, but it evolves a little bit, and can shift and change over time, which means that it is a bit of a moving target. It's something that has some limitations as a political force, because of the flexible geography of it, in that unlike Quebec, Quebec can speak with one political voice. The 4 Western provinces, of course, have four political voices, which at times talk with each other and at times talk against each other. And so that can be sort of a limitation that people often will refer to. But there's also a strength with flexible geography, in that different parts of the region can attach to different issues as it so chooses. So one thing I find very interesting about Western alienation is that people in Alberta will at times refer to the CF18 maintenance decision, which was a case where a Winnipeg bid lost out to a Quebec bid, and that was seen as being regionally unfair. Now, it had no actual relation to people in Alberta, but it sort of played into a larger narrative. So that ability to sort of draw examples from disparate provincial settings, I think, can be something that really speaks to some of the resilience of Western alienation. It also can provide a bit of a limitation in terms of the leverage aspect of Western alienation within Canadian federalism, and just some quotations of people in Alberta voicing these particular concerns. This was a letter to the editor to the Calgary Sun just this January. And this person was writing along the lines of without the ability to wave a big stick, we're going to routinely get shafted and ignored. And so that there's sort of this feeling of being diminished in this division. Another very similar comment, very different letter to the editor. Without a credible separatist threat, Alberta's plight will at best be ignored, or at least quietly celebrated. And so, this sort of speaks to these sentiments of disrespect and being outside. So all of these things, I believe, play into this this very resilient sense of Western alienation, regional discontent, and something I think that speaks to national disunity rather than national unity. And then the question becomes, well, so what? I often hear that comment as well. Well, Western Canada's upset, Alberta's upset again. There they go again. Who cares? Why does this matter? And I find that to be an interesting question. One I think that we should give some thought to. As I've described it, and the way I see it, the Western alienation is really speaking to the sense of being outside and wanting in, as being a sense of frustrated nationalism, of an expression of a desire for a particular type of country that's not being experienced. It's really a challenge to the assumptions of how Canada should work, and an argument that the dominant narratives of Canada are being grounded in the experiences of central Canada, while ignoring the experiences of other parts of Canada. And I do believe that's very true about Western alienation, but I think it's important to keep in mind that this is not the only challenge to the dominant narrative. That Quebec nationalism could be seen as another example of sort of a challenge against this dominant narrative. That this is, we see this with Indigenous nationalisms. We see this with other expressions of different social and political identities. And it makes me often think of an experience I had. It was I think it was about 10 years ago, but I had the pleasure for a number of years of talking about Western alienation with the Canadian Forces College. And for those of you who aren't aware of the Canadian Forces College, what CFC does is these are mid-career military, mostly men, but a lot of women there too, and they're working on advancing their understanding of Canada and more professional programming. And so I would come in and be part of a module they would do about understanding Canada. And so I would often put up this particular slide, and the background on this editorial cartoon, it's from 1915. It's known as the Milch Cow, and it's a very famous cartoon that really speaks to the sense of exploitation that was being felt on the prairies at the time. And if you look at the cartoon, and I apologize, it looks a little fuzzy on the screen right now, but if you look at the cartoon, we have these hardworking farmers in the prairies, and they're feeding the cow, which is representative of the national economy, and then we see these bankers, and you can tell they're bankers because they look like little Monopoly men, and they're milking the cow, and their buckets are labeled Ottawa, Toronto, and Montreal. And if you look closer at the cartoon, still you can see sweat coming off the prairie farmers, and you can see that the bankers are all laughing. And I had presented this to the Canadian Forces College audience, and as I was speaking, I put this image up. There's a voice that came from the room, and this one of the attendees, and he was very polite about it, but he said, "Ma'am," he said, "I just have to interrupt you here and let you know something." He said, I'm from the Maritimes, and I don't mean any disrespect, but I cannot help but notice which way the ass end of that cow is pointed." And I think, we often, when we talk about regional discontent, we forget about the fact that this is a longstanding issue in Atlantic Canada as well. So to go back to those Confederation of Tomorrow data that I shared earlier, this is an expanded view of Canada as a whole. And what you can see here is that, yes, we've got this strong discontent in Western Canada, what we refer to as Western alienation. But if we look at the other hinterlands, we see some points of concern there as well. Newfoundland in particular, but there's this larger sense of feeling of a lack of cohesiveness as a country, and I find that to be quite concerning. I find that to be something that doesn't always work to our benefit as a country. We see this sort of concern that we're always, as a country, having to balance all these different regional concerns, all these different interests. And all this reaction to the centering of this original central Canadian vision of Canada and how it's played out over time. And I do think that this is something that's worthy of discussing and worthy of paying attention to, not because I think it's the dominant issue for Canada to pay attention to, but because I think there's other issues that Canada really should be paying attention to. And the fact that we haven't sorted this out yet, I think is a lot of energy that's being lost in areas where we could be being perhaps a bit more productive. One of my research collaborators, Jared Wesley, wrote with Alex Marland about some of the core cleavages in Canadian politics, these core points of division in Canadian politics, and they identified geography as being one of the 3 core cleavages in Canadian politics. And they write that these core political cleavages leave little room for additional forms of political expression and debate. Other lines of division, such as gender and class, often fail to achieve long-term salience. And I think this is very true. I think the fact that we spend so much time having to deal with this original vision of Canada and these reactions to it is something that perhaps leaves us unable to deal with other issues that people might be also wanting to address and tackle. So with that, I'm just going to stop talking and turn things over to the questions. Before I do want to make a few acknowledgements. The first is I'd like to acknowledge Roger Gibbons, who as I've mentioned before, I've worked with on the Western alienation topic for decades now, and he and I have developed a lot of these ideas together. I'd like to acknowledge my amazing research assistant, Kirsten Sampson, who pulled together a lot of the census data and such for me. And I'd like to thank Andrew Parkin for sharing the Confederation of Tomorrow data with me to share with you. And with that, I will stop talking and I'll catch my breath, and I'm going to try to stop the screen share. I will just actually note, if you want to get in touch with me, it's a great way to do so is by Twitter. I spend far too much time there. So let's see if I can stop my screen share. There we go.